Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you're so welcome here this afternoon. Thank you for attending. And another big round of applause before we start for Sheena and Ira. So as we'd say in Ireland, Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes to you all. JLF has a very long tradition of thoroughly spoiling our readers. And this session is going to do exactly that. And I'm going to plunge into the questions straight away so that we have time for a few questions from the audience at the end. So how do I even begin to describe Sheena Patel's book, I Am a Fan, except to say that it absolutely blew me away. It was brutally honest, and its exploration of obsessive desire aided and abetted by that very toxic combination of Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook. And here is the book. I can tell you it's an absolutely fantastic read. Go out and buy it immediately after this session. So there can't be many of you in the audience who haven't indulged in a little bit of part-time, online snooping on friends and family. Yeah, it's okay, you're amongst friends, you can confess to it. We've all done it, but what happens when nosiness becomes unstoppable, self-destructive even? So I'm going to let Sheena tell us about it herself. Sheena, how would you describe your book? And when you've done describing a book, would you tell us about your thought process? I mean, how did you even pitch the idea to yourself?
How did I pitch the idea? Well, first of all, I want to say I'm so honoured to be at Jaipur Festival. I've heard about it for many years and never thought that I would be here, so I'm really honoured and a bit emotional to be here. But so the book is about a girl that gets involved in a toxic relationship with a man and his other lover and starts to stalk him online and the other lover online. And although it's a spiral, it kind of descends into a spiral and it doesn't really go anywhere. So it's sort of a character that stays in the same spot and just sort of descends. And the underlayer of it is about race and class and how the internet functions, and it's about London as well. So there's two things going on.
Yeah, exactly. And did it develop from the long pamphlet essay that you wrote for Brown Girls?
No, I didn't really mean to write this in the sense that so this is by Granta, because once the book started to get a bit of attention, Granta bought the paperback license as a thing, and it got distributed a lot wider. But initially, I was with a very small publisher called Rough Trade Books, and it's essentially a couple, Nina and Will Burns, who have supported my writing from the beginning, and without them I wouldn't be writing, and also without Four Brown Girls I wouldn't be writing. But Nina essentially was, because I was totally depressed in the pandemic, and she was like, write a book, and I was like, okay. So that's how I did it, and I didn't really have an outline or anything. It was more, I was just combing the internet for pictures that were disturbing me and things I was thinking about, and then sort of condensed it into something.
Okay. I mean, you have to read the book to see the complete spiral of kind of crazy madness that that the unnamed narrator kind of begins to get sucked into. And I'm just wondering, did you find yourself getting sucked into that narrative yourself? I mean, were you surprised at where the book was going?
Well, to be honest, at the beginning I thought it was going to be a book of pictures. I didn't think it would be a novel, but I was working really closely with Will, and he and I were sort of passing the manuscript together, between us, and I saw it was very associative. It wasn't. I didn't have a plan. I was sort of dreaming and writing, and it was lockdown, so I wasn't seeing anyone, and I was working remotely, so I was like in my room a lot, just sort of typing. So I didn't really know where the character was going, and it was more like a dream sequence. So I was like, oh, today she'd go to a gallery. What would she do? What's the worst thing she could do in a gallery? Or what's the worst? I just wanted to humiliate her, basically, but then find the joke in that, because it is quite funny to do that to yourself.
Yeah.
So it was humiliating, but also poking fun. And
would you? Sorry.
No, I was in it for the joke.
Yeah. Would you tell our audience exactly what happens, to this woman, without giving too much away, obviously?
Well, I mean, nothing happens, really. It's a book about rejection and about loneliness and about the ways in which love within this kind of should be a sacred, private, personal space, how that is actually compounded by society, and how if society treats you like you're expendable, that you have to try really hard, that it doesn't matter how many rejections you get, you keep going. That can bleed into your romantic life. Like, how can you tell the difference between somebody telling you, no, I don't want to be with you, and a job or an industry or whatever, society telling you, you don't belong here. The only option is to try. So I wanted to bring that close together, like knit those things together. And also with conspiracy theorists, I mean, everybody knows a conspiracy theorist, and everyone is a conspiracy theorist now, but like even 4 years ago when you saw QAnon and the attacks on the Capitol, I just woke up, I didn't even wake up, it was at night. It was just at night, and this bright day coming through my laptop of this like crazy thing happening at the Capitol.
Yeah.
And I just thought that behaviour of a man telling a group of people to go and attack the Capitol is exactly what you would be like in a relationship with someone unavailable. It's like you totemise this person and they have total power over everything that you do in your life. So it was to not make anything strange. I didn't want to condemn anybody.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful the way you, the way you escalate her obsession with the man who she wants to be, his ex. The way you escalate that was just amazing. It was wonderful. It kind of kept building up, and you just wonder, where is this going to go, and what is she going to do with it? I actually thought she might, do something to that woman in the end. But anyway, thank you. So I'm just going to turn to Ira now. And Ira actually has a short video that perhaps we could see before I actually talk to her.
Like many immigrants, the islands allowed me to reinvent myself. Fragment by fragment, leaf by leaf, I learned, as the poet taught us, to love the dark days.
Thank you. I don't know whether you can see Ira's book. It's called Love the Dark Days. It's a multi-layered, very beautiful, sad, and a redemptive memoir that sweeps through a completely vanished era and plays across several continents, tying together empire, gender, and race in a narrative that follows her border-crossing loves as an Indian immigrant in Trinidad and Tobago. Love the Dark Days is in part a rollicking ride through post-partition history. And it struck a really very personal chord with me. I began reading the book, and to my absolute delight, immediately recognized a closely shared childhood. I've never met Ira before. I didn't know anything about her. But from reading the book, it seemed that we had the exact same garrison towns and cantonments, the very same army trucks that took us to school, the regimental mess, the barrack houses. It was a life of a Fauji Bacha, otherwise known as army brats. So there was a flurry of emails back and forth between Ira and myself as we explored the coincidence of our parents actually knowing each other, even though only in passing. I mean, JLF couldn't have organized it in a better way. Our fathers were officers in the Indian Army and served in the same Corps of Engineers and were both very proud Madras sappers. So to Ira, I say, to write a warts and all memoir about your family and fairly fraught family life while they're alive is a very brave thing to do. And to do it when you're Indian deserves nothing but a Param Vishisht Seva medal. What compelled you to write the memoir, in their time while they were alive, and how did you research the historical details?
Thank you so much, and it's such a delight to be here amongst you all. And it was lovely to meet you as well, Kovri. I think the answer to that is, as a journalist, there are things that you can't write about, can't not write about. And as I had children in Trinidad, so far from India, I realized that my world was becoming untethered. So I was in this small island in Tobago with a population maybe of about 40,000 people, and my country and my ancestors came from a country of then 1.1 billion people and now 1.4 billion people. And I had this horror of all of it being lost. But most of all, I wanted to write the story of my grandmother, a woman who was so ahead of her time. As a journalist myself, as a mother, as a professional, I have struggled in the world, as I think all us women have. We've struggled against patriarchy, we've struggled against men patronizing us, and we've often wondered, can we do it on our own? And when I think about Badi Mummy, who's in this book, she was born into a very privileged home. She was the princess of the state of Savnur. She married into the state of Bhopal. And, in those days, it was actually quite common for princesses to put up with infidelity. And my grandfather was a beautiful and handsome man, but he loved two things more than he could ever love my grandmother, which is horses and women. So once my grandmother realized that this was a battle she could not win, she literally left Bhopal as a very young mother, left that entire princely lifestyle, and she went to live in Savnur. And then she even left her parents' house in Savnur, and whatever little she had got from her father in Savnur, she took nothing from Bhopal, which was one of the richest states at the time. And she bought a house in Bangalore, which was 17 Rest House Road, just opposite Cubbon Park, for those of you who are from Bangalore. And she got tenants, and she lived there, and she made her life there. But the biggest thing for my grandmother was she sacrificed her dream. She was a pianist. She was a brilliant pianist, and she got into Vienna with a scholarship. But when she was 17 and 18, she was not allowed to be a pianist. And all her life, she was vilified. They called her a difficult woman. They called her a woman who could not compromise. They called her a woman who shouted, who talked too loud, who spoke her mind a little bit too much. And I think maybe I gradually, as a journalist, found myself becoming a little of that. And I thought, at this point, when she died, I needed to tell the real story of Badi Mummy.
So I was going to leave this to the end, but I know you're quite emotional about it. But I have to say that by the end of the book, I was so sympathetic towards her. I really was. It is an amazing story. And, the repercussions of having been treated so badly, the repercussions of having given up so much to make a stand and move away from her husband's people, Yeah, that's how Sheena ended up in Trinidad and Tobago. You know, it's an amazing story. I'm just going to move on to a slightly different aspect of both your books. As first or second generation immigrants, and I'm a first generation immigrant into Ireland, we lead our lives riding our hyphenated self-descriptors, whether it be Brit-Asian, Indo-Trinidadian, Indo-Irish, and we very carefully balance this, you know, it's a precarious socio-cultural seesaw, you know, that hyphen, Indo-British, you know, we're kind of, you know, seesawing between the two. And Sheena, I quote from early on in your book, where you say, "The easiest route to building a following is to penetrate culture, and the fastest way to do this is to tell them the story they want to hear, the one about our assimilation to whiteness, or the appearance of failure of this assimilation, so that white people with the keys to the castle can gasp and shake their heads and say, 'I never knew it was this bad.' And perhaps then they would lower the drawbridge to let us in." Sheena, this is a really stark truth that not many of us writers of immigrant backgrounds want to hear. Telling people the stories they want to hear versus the truth. Could you talk a little about that?
There's a chapter, the novel's told in fragments because I don't know how to write plot, so it was an easy way for me to write a book. But one of the sections is like a tirade, and it was one of the sections that I was most afraid of because it sort of attacks British Asians and brown people in general. But I think the thing that I was frustrated about was reading books about a homeland that I don't know anything about. It's my first time in India. I don't know anything, and it felt to me that nostalgia. We just had Brexit and all of that, and the nostalgia for the past for me feels dangerous. Because it feels like you can capitalize on a story of someone else's victimization as your own. And I have privileges that my parents don't have, and I wanted to own that. And I wanted to tell the story of now. It will date, and I'm fine with that. I didn't need to tell a timeless story that like spanned centuries. I wanted to tell the story of 2022 and encapsulate that year. And the technology will date and the references will lose their meaning, but I wanted the now to be captured, and I just was afraid that has not been really documented within the sort of Asian women's writing. But I also didn't really give a shit about being Asian and being brown and being second generation. I didn't also care about that. I wanted to tell a story that was frightening and rebellious and dirty, and there's sex in it and there's swearing, and I didn't want to feel like, oh, I can't write about that because my parents might read it, my family won't. You know, I didn't want to self-censor. So, and I felt like books like that hadn't really claimed those things, books from brown authors, that the more tougher side of being a woman nowadays.
I mean, I think it's absolutely, I have to say, it took my breath away. I was blown away by your boldness. Do you know, because the first thing I thought of, because I'm old enough to be much older than your mother, I'm sure, the first thing I thought was, oh my God, have her parents read this? Do you know, that was my first thing.
They don't read, so I'm lucky. But also, they just know not to read it.
Yeah, so that was my first reaction. And then my second reaction was, fair play to you. You know, because I think, you know, we, as immigrants, we are so careful about curating our stories that we must always and forever be the good immigrant. You know, most of the time, we're just ordinary people with ordinary problems and, ordinary failings like everybody else. Why do we always have to be, have to prove ourselves 20 times more? And yeah.
But I was I was interested in speaking back to victimization. And this is not to say that colonialization and that the history is not important. I'm deeply invested in that. But I also didn't want, it felt like telling that story primarily wasn't going to help us develop in any way, because in order to be a fully rounded person, you need to admit the light and the dark. And so that's what I wanted the book to be, was a reconciliation of wholeness.
Thank you. And on a kind of a linked topic, Ira, I finished a book, Unexpectedly Sympathetic, and actually loving your grandmother, Burry Mummy. There are lines from the book that pertain to her that seem to me to echo Sheena's sentiments in I Am a Fan. And I quote these lines in particular. Love can be shit wrapped in silver, but who's to say some of the shine doesn't drop off the shit and make us yearn for more? And this one as well, this quote as well. Burry Mummy's rage is part of what they must accept to survive. Love and violence are one. So talk to us about the notion of love and violence switching places for one for the other so often in your narrative.
I think as a journalist, you tend to see things in concentric circles. So in a sense, if we think of ourselves as colonies here in England, here in India and in Trinidad, there's so much actually we do love that the British have done. And we love their teas, we've liked their cucumber sandwiches, and we've loved their architecture. And yet, if you think of the kind of brutality that we have suffered in India, and we have actually, all of empire has suffered. So in a sense, that was intertwined. It was always intertwined. It happened going back to the mutiny at a time when the British used our own Faujis, our own Hindu and Muslim soldiers, putting pig fat and beef on their rifles to actually shoot at our own mutineers. So it started with that. And when you think about if it goes into a smaller concentric circles, that seeps down into institutions. So you see the hierarchy in institutions. In India, you see it, the fair-skinned people, the people with the money, and then the business, and then it goes down to the servants and the servants' children. And similarly, you see that same thing in families. So the power is situated with the father, the patriarchal figure, then the patriarch may be the mother-in-law, and then it goes down like that. And I wanted to make another very quick point about that. When I was very small, my grandmother told me a story about my great-grandmother, and Khalikhud Nisab Begum of Savnur. And in those days, they used to have those saris with small zari. I'm sure a lot of people here with sari, with grandmothers have those saris with the real gold. And every year on her French chiffon saris would be burnt at the bottom of the rose garden. And after the ashes it was all ash. She would wait until the ashes cooled, and she would go and she would pick out the gold from it. And I think even in my own life, and I got the title of the book from Derek Walcott, who wrote it about his sister, Love the Dark Days, that I think I realized the more I lived, the more I suffered, the more I learned that actually there's always some beauty and some gold to be brought from the dark days, which is why I can't...
Yes, that is a beautiful sentiment. Yeah. Do you know, that sentiment really reflects, the message of the book. It's such a redemptive book. And, for somebody who was, quite mean to your mother and to you in parts, on and off, to end up liking the woman, for the reader to end up liking her, actually being very sympathetic towards her is quite I think you told her story so beautifully. Thank you. So another thing I just wanted to explore was, Sheena, a chapter that really resonated with me was titled, I'll Huff and I'll Puff. It's short, so I'll read it out. As a teenager, I needed to be an ogre at home to frighten my parents so they didn't frighten me. If I breathed fire against them, I would scorch the earth around me, to have some semblance of autonomy. I applied my rage to protect myself. And then, concluding that same chapter, you go on to say, if I made them frightened of me, they wouldn't ask me where I was going, and I could do what I wanted without fear of what the community would think. My question to you, Sheena, is this book exactly that? Is it an ogre to protect yourself?
Oh, what a good question. Oh, I like that.
Is this book your big shout out, your scream to the world?
Well, it's angry. It is angry. And anger often in women gets suppressed and disowned. But anger has a real place in your emotional landscape. It's protective, it's regenerative, it does burn, but like something good comes out of it afterwards. And I think, oh, is it an ogre? I don't know. For me, there's this, really quickly, but there's this Jungian podcast that I listen to, and they talk about Sleeping Beauty and how, you know the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty, but the way they tell it is that it's not the prince that kisses Sleeping Beauty that wakes her up, it's her, it's Snow White, Snow White. It's her metabolizing the apple that she eats, that's what wakes her up, and it's incorporating the poison into her, so it's going from innocence to knowledge, and I wanted this book to be like that piece of apple. So not so much an ogre, but maybe like poison, but that's medicinal, even though that's not the way you say that word.
Okay. And Sheena, I particularly loved the conversation that you recollect having with the Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, where you tell him, and I quote, "So you are saying there is an advantage in forgetting old religions, old hatred, old languages. Maybe in a few generations after our children's children have finished with the gash of slavery and indentureship, we will have an identity that we all yearn for as humans. Maybe when people transplanted from old worlds, the Chinese, the Syrian, the Indo-European, and the African are fully integrated and cross-fertilize, our small islands will represent a utopia to the world." And Ira, you say he replied with a sly smile, "Now you're talking." So my question to you is, do you see this happening already? And is this the way we will, is it the only way we can negotiate our hyphenated existence?
Okay, I want to tell you that the Ministry of Tourism in Trinidad has not paid me, but I will say to you that it is literally the most magical twin island on earth. Here, in a small island of Port of Spain, as Derek Walcott and I did speak of, if you imagine the percolation in a tiny space of just a few miles, Europeans, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and along come the Venezuelans, the Syrians, the Chinese, the Nigerians, the Indians, the Africans, and we all percolate. The kind of identity that has emerged and that you will find during a carnival where the highest man, the highest judge of the land is like a beggar in a ditch on that day because he is filled with mud and paint, and the most gracious society hostess is literally, full of paint and mud and dancing with what her parents might say was with whole-like openness. But yet, that kind of talent has produced that tiny island. If you imagine, we have produced V.S. Naipaul. We claim Derek Walcott. We claim Earl Lovelace. We claim C.L.R. James. We claim we claim Brian Lara. And, just recently, in the last few years, several women just from Trinidad have been shortlisted for the Women's Prize in Literature in the UK. So I would say to you, I really did want to just quickly read a quote by Derek Walcott, and I would really urge you all to go and read his Nobel speech, which actually has changed the lives of so many. And he wrote, when he accepted his Nobel, he said, and this is what has happened to our islands, break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. Either I'm nobody or I'm a nation.
Okay, so it looks like we have just enough time for questions now. Thank you, Sheena. Thank you, Ira. And we're happy to take questions. This lady right here.
You talked about Derek Walcott, and I was reminded of his very famous poem, The White Magic, in which he has deplored the fact that the indigenous myths of those people belonging to that area, they are not there.
Yes.
They've lost their identity. Because I teach literature, and I've taught Derek Walcott, I was reminded of that. So I'll come to that later. But I have a question from, it was a wonderful, session today. I have a question from all the panelists today. I mean, as leading hyphenated existence, I want to ask one question and want an honest answer. Apart from the usual routes that an immigrant has to follow of assimilation and hybridization, don't you feel privileged to be an immigrant? I mean, the way I see the sea of humanity voluntarily crossing borders and finally choosing to settle in the country of their dreams, how much homing desire is left? Is nostalgia just a lyrical pain? How many of those settled in countries of privilege have the real desire to come back if given a chance? Thank you.
Can we get a mic to this lady over here, please, just so that that's happened? Who answers that? Who is that
Do you want
to?
to start? Sorry, do you want to start?
Me? Oh my God. Is it a privilege? Yeah, it is a privilege. Of course it's a privilege. But you're not just the country where you're born, you're also the country where you're from. And even though I've never been to India before, so it's been really intense to be here, especially on my own, because usually people come here with families and stuff like that. But I've had to meet it solo. But it's been really good to see 2 generations back where my family were from. And you do mourn the things you don't know, because there is a dignity in the women here that I don't feel I have. I'm gauche and gauche, and I don't have this sort of deeper knowledge of I've lost something. I know that I've lost something, and you mourn that which you don't even know. So I don't even have the words for it really, but it is sort of, it's sad. I don't know. It's of course it's good being British. I love being British. I'm like the most English person I know, but also there's a sadness there.
How about you, Sheena?
I think for me there's always a sense of permanent nostalgia, but I think I had it from the age of 4 or 5 because my father was in the army, and we moved from Chandigarh to Bangalore. There was nostalgia from Punjabi to learning Kannada, from Bangalore to Delhi, from Delhi to Simla. So my entire life, I think, has been made up of nostalgia, and I think in that nostalgia I found beauty. Trinidad and Tobago is not a first world country, we're a developing country, and there's a great deal of beauty. It doesn't come with any, I wouldn't say it comes with more privilege than India at all. In fact, if you look at India now, Trinidad feels much less developed. So I think it's a case of nostalgia and being able to carry that nostalgia with you like a gift.
Okay. Thank you, Sheena. Well, just to briefly answer from my point of view, and you asked for an honest answer, and I'm giving you an honest answer. I actually have no nostalgia for India. I only have nostalgia for the food. And I don't mean that as a joke. I genuinely mean that. Because the way I look at it is, I'm a first-generation immigrant into Ireland. I absolutely love Ireland. Ireland has been very good to me. And for me, my home is where my children are. And I'm going to have a baby granddaughter in another few days. So Ireland is my home. And, it took me a while before I was able to admit it. But I'm now very proud to admit it. So I think we have one more question.
Thank you so much for a wonderful session. I really enjoyed it. I have one small question for Sina and another one for Ira. Ira, I just got interested in the title of the session, Hyphenated Narrative. So I just want to think of the question of the genre. Because in post-colonialism or in diaspora studies, we do talk about fractured narratives. So are hyphenated narratives just another term for fractured narratives? Are they same? Or do you think at the level of, like in the definition-wise, do you see hyphenated narratives something different there? And my question for Sheena is, having myself spent a few years in England, I used to have this idea, when you are abroad, you I'm Indian, but I don't practice all Indian ways. But suddenly when I was in Britain, there is this pressure of distinguishing myself from British. I don't want to become completely British. Like, I want to preserve my Indianness. This just becomes an unconscious, stress sort of a thing. And because I got intrigued by how your book was introduced by Kaveri, that have your parents read about your book. So I just wanted to know about, is there a kind of tussle in your head also, a pressure to represent India in some context, some way? So thank you so much.
That's such a beautiful question, and I have to say that every party I go to in India, I wear sari. I just don't, so that's my way of saying, yes, this is me. And I want to tell you a very, very quick joke of when I arrived in Tobago as a young 11-year-old girl, this thin, 90 pounds, and I could not actually understand what the girl in my class, who was the head girl, or what she was saying to me. She was about 6 foot, and I said to her, she was saying something to me, and I said, I don't understand what you're saying. I said, do you speak English? And she looked at me and she said, who the ass you think you are, you blasted coolie? So I think I really infuriated her, because I said, I think she thought I was stupid, and I said, in my real Indian accent, I said, but we don't lift loads. And she said, you are so infuriating, you don't even understand an insult. And I think that that's the beauty of hyphenated narratives, in that it's just all cross-cultural. But what we have realized, those of us who are not situated in a single place feel very privileged, because in that way, like we've said before, it allows us to be fully human all over the world. So it's about India, I think, is about soul, and the world over is about souls meeting souls.